At dawn, the snow had not yet melted, and the patrol officer stopped breathing when boot prints ended at the culvert, where a winter coat snagged on ice. A purse lay half-buried, and the silence felt engineered, deliberate, waiting for gloved hands and evidence bags to disturb it. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. Idaho in December of 1995 carried a particular quiet, a kind that settled early and lingered, shaped by short days and long nights, by radios humming in cruisers and heaters ticking in kitchens. The town sat between a river and a highway, familiar to men who had driven it for decades, men who measured seasons by plowing routes and courthouse calendars. When the missing person flyer appeared at the grocery store entrance, it was printed on white paper that curled at the corners, a young woman's face framed by winter light. Her name was Rebecca Lynn Harper, 22 years old, recently graduated, newly employed, and last seen days before Christmas. Rebecca had been home for Thanksgiving, had lingered longer than planned, had spoken about returning after New Year's. She rented a small basement apartment near the old rail spur, a place with low ceilings and a single window that frosted over by dusk. On December 19th, she clocked out at the insurance office just before 5, darkness already set in. She stopped for groceries, the receipt later recovered from her coat pocket, time-stamped and mundane. She never arrived home. By Christmas Eve, her car remained parked on the street, a thin rind of ice forming along the windshield wipers. The initial report followed protocol. Officers knocked on doors, checked hospitals, contacted friends, logged phone calls. The weather complicated everything. Snow fell again on the 21st, then again on the 23rd, compressing time and erasing edges. When a county road crew noticed a purse near the culvert outside town, it was treated first as lost property, then as something else. The location sat along a route locals used to avoid holiday traffic, a bend where headlights swung wide, and the river ran dark beneath ice. Evidence was gathered slowly, methodically, with the restraint of people trained not to invent meaning. The purse held a driver's license, a small address book, a receipt, keys without a car fob. No blood, no weapon, no obvious sign of struggle. The coat was Rebecca, confirmed by her mother, who identified a repaired seam. The boot prints nearby were partial, size indeterminate, direction unclear. Photographs were taken, measurements recorded, the scene sketched with gloved hands and stiff pencils. An autopsy would come later, after a search that lasted days and then weeks, after the holiday lights were taken down, and the town returned to work. Rebecca was found downstream in early January, when a thaw loosened the river's grip. The coroner's report would note hypothermia and blunt force injuries consistent with a fall or push, timing estimated within hours of her disappearance. The language was clinical, careful, a document meant to stand up years later if needed. The investigation widened and narrowed in cycles. Detectives reconstructed Rebecca's last day through bank records, witness statements, and a timeline pinned to corkboard. She had called her sister at noon, mailed a card at lunch, been seen alone at the checkout. No one reported an argument, no one reported a ride. The insurance office provided a list of clients she had met with that week. The grocery store tapes were reviewed until the images blurred. A young woman in a winter coat moving through aisles that looked like any other. Local media covered the case with restraint, the way small papers do when they know the people involved. Headlines avoided speculation. Radio updates aired between weather reports. The sheriff held briefings that said little beyond process. Flyers multiplied on bulletin boards and telephone poles, their staples rusting. Candlelight vigils were held and then stopped when temperatures fell too low. Suspects emerged and faded. A former boyfriend was interviewed and cleared by work records. A transient was questioned and released. A neighbor reported a scream but could not place the night. Each lead was logged, each cleared or left unresolved, the file growing heavier as months passed. By spring, the case moved from active to cold, though the label felt like an insult to those who kept working it. Years layered over the file. Officers retired, detectives transferred, evidence was boxed and shelved in a room that smelled of paper and dust. Technology changed. DNA databases expanded. The town changed too, subtly, with new storefronts and repaved roads, but men who had been there in 1995 remembered where they were when the news came. Every December, someone would ask quietly whether there was anything new. The break did not come with drama. It came with a routine audit in 2018 when the department reviewed unsolved cases eligible for new testing. Rebecca's clothing was re-examined. A trace on the coat, previously deemed inconclusive, was sent to a lab with methods unavailable in the 90s. The result was a partial profile, enough to enter into a national system, enough to wait. A match returned in 2021, not a name but a family tree, distant and statistical. Analysts worked backward, cross-referencing public records, narrowing by geography and age. The name that emerged belonged to a man who had lived in town in 1995, worked nights, driven a route that passed the Culvert. He had moved away in 1997, married, divorced, and lived quietly. His name was Thomas Edward Klein. Investigators approached carefully, building a case that would hold. They pulled employment records, vehicle registrations, old traffic citations. They reviewed interview notes from 1995 and found his name mentioned once, a brief contact, no follow-up. A warrant was obtained for a DNA sample collected lawfully, compared independently. The match was conclusive. When the arrest was made, it happened without spectacle. Klein was taken into custody at his residence in another state, extradited, arraigned. The charges reflected the evidence and the law as it stood then and now. At trial, the narrative was slow and precise. The jury saw maps, timelines, lab reports. They heard about winter conditions, about how a push at the riverbank could produce the injuries described, about opportunity and proximity. The verdict came after days of deliberation. Guilty. Sentencing followed statutory guidelines. Rebecca's family attended, older now, carrying the weight of years. Statements were read into the record, measured, restrained. Outside the courthouse, snow fell lightly, the same quiet returning. Afterward, the town did not celebrate. It acknowledged. Files were closed, evidence returned or destroyed according to policy. A bench was placed near the river with a small plaque. Each December, men driving home noticed it, slowed, and remembered a winter long ago when a young woman did not make it home. The investigation's longevity was marked by discipline rather than luck. Cold case officers documented chain of custody reviews, verified storage conditions, and re-interviewed witnesses with memory decay in mind. They sought corroboration rather than confession, comparing snowfall records with road maintenance logs, checking whether the culvert had been plowed on the night in question, and confirming visibility conditions from archived weather data. Phone records, once inaccessible, were revisited to establish absence as well as presence, and financial activity was audited for anomalies that might suggest movement or contact. Media attention returned briefly, respectful and restrained. The local paper printed a retrospective that quoted the original sheriff's statements verbatim, a reminder of how little had been said then. National outlets noted the arrest as an example of persistence rather than novelty. The prosecutor emphasized the absence of shortcuts, the reliance on lawful warrants and peer-reviewed science. Defense motions were heard and denied in written orders that cited precedent. Appeals were filed and exhausted. In the quiet aftermath, investigators met to debrief, documenting lessons learned for future cases. They recommended periodic reviews, broader evidence retention, and community communication that balanced transparency with integrity. The department archived the file digitally, ensuring redundancy. Rebecca's name remained in the index, now marked resolved, a single word that carried decades. As another winter arrived, the town moved forward, slower perhaps, but steadier, having finally set down a burden carried since 1995. For men who had watched the years turn, the resolution affirmed patience and procedure. It showed how records matter, how seasons repeat, how truth can surface without noise. The river kept moving, the courthouse kept its files, and December returned with lights and cold. The case closed did not restore what was lost, but it clarified what happened, and that clarity, arrived lawfully, was enough to let memory rest. It remained a reminder that ordinary diligence can outlast time when communities refuse to forget responsibility and duty end. By the spring following Rebecca Harper's death, the investigation had settled into a disciplined routine that older detectives recognized well. Leads were pursued not because they promised resolution, but because procedure demanded they be closed properly. The case file grew thicker as each interview transcript, lab request, and property log was added. Pages smelled faintly of carbon paper and ink. Nothing about the work felt dramatic. It felt patient, repetitive, and heavy, like the seasons themselves. Rebecca's apartment was processed twice. The first time occurred within 48 hours of her disappearance, when officers cataloged what was missing and what remained untouched. The second took place weeks later, after her body had been recovered and the coroner's preliminary findings were known. Detectives returned with fresh eyes, confirming timelines and rephotographing items that now carried different meaning. Her bed was neatly made. A calendar hung above a small desk, December dates marked with routine obligations. Christmas Day had been circled, with the word home written lightly in pencil. Neighbors were re-interviewed. Memory, detectives knew, was unreliable, but patterns mattered. One neighbor recalled hearing a car idle longer than usual on the 19th. Another mentioned headlights sweeping across the basement window sometime after 6. None of it was specific enough to stand alone. All of it was logged. Patrol officers checked traffic stop records along the river road, confirming no citations or calls had been made that night. Snowfall reports were requested from the county highway department, detailing plow times and accumulation depth. Rebecca's social circle was small. She worked, studied for professional exams, and called her parents regularly. Friends described her as cautious, not prone to impulsive decisions. No one recalled her accepting rides from strangers. Phone records showed no outgoing calls after she left the grocery store. Incoming calls went unanswered. Investigators confirmed the grocery store's exterior cameras had malfunctioned that week, a fact documented in maintenance logs and later included in the case summary as a limitation rather than an omission. The autopsy findings guided the investigation quietly. The coroner avoided speculation, stating only what could be supported. Hypothermia was consistent with environmental exposure. Blunt force trauma suggested an event near the riverbank. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of prolonged struggle. Time of death was estimated within a narrow window. For detectives, it suggested speed and familiarity with the area rather than chance. As winter gave way to spring, the sheriff authorized a regional bulletin. Nearby counties reviewed their unsolved assaults and missing persons. No immediate connections surfaced. A vehicle of interest was briefly considered after a tip described a dark pickup scene near the Culvert. The description matched dozens registered locally. All were checked. None were linked. The tip was closed, its source thanked, its conclusion documented. The first anniversary arrived quietly. Rebecca's parents attended a private memorial near the river, accompanied by a deputy who had been assigned as family liaison. The department issued a short statement reaffirming the case remained open. Internally, it was reclassified as inactive pending new information. Evidence was sealed and stored according to policy, each item tagged and indexed. The room where it was kept held dozens of similar boxes, each representing a question left unanswered. Years passed. The town grew modestly. The grocery store renovated. The rail spur was removed. Officers rotated assignments. The case survived through habit and respect. Each December, a detective would pull the file, read it again, and confirm nothing had been missed. These reviews produced marginal notes, suggestions, and occasional new interviews when technology allowed old records to be re-examined. In the early 2000s, DNA testing was discussed, but deemed unlikely to yield results. The trace evidence from Rebecca's coat was minimal, degraded, and contaminated by water exposure. Lab reports from the time reflected the limits clearly. The decision not to pursue further testing was documented and approved. No one wanted assumptions to substitute for science. By 2010, cold case units were formalized statewide. Rebecca's file was scanned, indexed, and entered into a centralized database. Younger investigators reviewed it alongside older colleagues who remembered the original search. Questions were asked again. Why that road? Why that time? Why no witnesses? Each answer remained incomplete, but the consistency of the narrative mattered. The pivotal review began quietly in late 2018. A grant allowed retesting of evidence previously considered unusable. Rebecca's coat was removed from storage, its chain of custody verified line by line. Lab technicians used updated extraction techniques, working slowly to preserve what remained. The resulting partial profile was limited but viable. It was entered into national systems without expectation. The waiting period lasted years. Analysts monitored distant matches, constructing hypothetical family trees with caution. The work was statistical, methodical, and slow. When a likely lineage emerged, it pointed back to Idaho in the mid-1990s. Investigators cross-checked names against old employment rosters, traffic records, and addresses. Thomas Edward Klein appeared as a peripheral figure, once interviewed, never followed. Re-interviews began in early 2021. Detectives traveled, speaking with former coworkers and neighbors. Klein's movements after 1995 were reconstructed from leases, pay stubs, and utility records. Nothing overtly incriminating surfaced, but proximity and opportunity aligned. A judge authorized a warrant for DNA collection based on the cumulative record. The sample confirmed what the data suggested. The arrest unfolded without urgency. Klein complied. He was informed of the charge, transported, and extradited. Court filings were meticulous. Defense counsel challenged the evidence, focusing on time and degradation. Prosecutors responded with documentation, expert testimony, and peer review citations. The jury heard no speculation, only process. The trial concluded with a verdict supported by record and reason. Sentencing reflected statutory limits and aggravating factors. Appeals affirmed the findings. For the department, closure meant documentation, notification, and care. Rebecca Harper's case was marked solved, not erased, its lessons retained. The aftermath was restrained. No banners, no speeches, just winter returning, the river freezing again, and a bench placed where the road bends. The town acknowledged the truth quietly, satisfied that diligence had endured. The conviction did not end the work. In the months following the verdict, investigators were required to complete a comprehensive post-case review, a process intended not for public consumption but for institutional memory. Every document was checked again, not to reopen doubt, but to confirm that the case could withstand scrutiny decades into the future. Evidence logs were reconciled with digital scans. Lab reports were cross-referenced with testimony transcripts. The goal was permanence, not celebration. Rebecca Harper's name appeared repeatedly in those documents, always paired with dates, initials, and locations. The file now told a complete story, beginning with a grocery receipt and ending with a sentencing order. Older deputies recognized how unusual that was. Many cases from the 1990s ended with gaps. This one ended with alignment. That mattered to men who had spent careers watching investigations dissolve into uncertainty. The district attorney's office issued a final procedural summary. It described the lawful basis for reopening the case, the scientific methods used, and the evidentiary thresholds met at each stage. There was no emotional language. The summary read like a manual entry, suitable for training. It emphasized restraint, particularly the decision not to pursue arrest until corroboration existed beyond the DNA match. Opportunity, proximity, and historical contact had been required before action was taken. Rebecca's family requested limited privacy. They declined interviews, issuing a brief written statement acknowledging the work of law enforcement and the jury. The statement was printed once in the local paper and then archived. It avoided adjectives. It spoke of endurance, not relief. For the community, that tone set the boundary. There would be no prolonged attention. The courthouse returned to routine. Files moved on carts through hallways polished by decades of foot traffic. Judges resumed crowded dockets. The clerk's office stamped documents with practiced efficiency. Yet for those who remembered 1995, the resolution lingered. It surfaced in casual remarks about how long things can take, how evidence must be preserved even when hope is thin. In the sheriff's department, younger officers were briefed on the case during winter training sessions, not as a story but as a sequence. They were shown how early assumptions had been avoided, how negative results were recorded rather than ignored, how patience had prevented error. The lesson was clear. Time is not the enemy if procedure is intact. The river road where Rebecca was last seen changed little. Snow still collected in drifts along the culvert. Plow trucks followed the same routes. Drivers slowed at the bend without knowing why. The bench placed nearby was modest, its plaque small and unadorned. It listed her name, her age, and the year, nothing more. That restraint reflected the investigation itself. Archival practices evolved because of the case. The department invested in improved storage, environmental controls, and redundant digital backups. They documented best practices for handling trace evidence exposed to water and cold. These changes were incremental, bureaucratic, and essential. They did not attract attention. They ensured that other names might someday reach resolution. Thomas Klein was transferred to a state facility after sentencing. Intake records noted age, health status, and security classification. There were no incidents during processing. His appeals were filed on schedule, reviewed, and denied in written opinions that cited the record extensively. Those opinions became part of the case file, completing the legal arc. Years later, during another December, a reporter requested access to archived material for a retrospective on cold cases. The request was partially granted. Redactions were applied. The resulting article focused less on the crime and more on the method. It described how quiet persistence can outlast decades, how institutions matter when individuals change. Rebecca Harper's name appeared again briefly in that piece. It was contextual, not sensational. Readers recognized it. Some remembered the flyers. Others remembered nothing but the cold of that winter. The article concluded without flourish, mirroring the case itself. For the men who had followed the investigation from the beginning, the resolution settled into memory alongside other milestones. It joined retirements, storms, and elections as markers of time. They did not speak of it often. When they did, it was usually in terms of process, not outcome. The case demonstrated that closure is not an event but a condition. It arrives when questions stop multiplying, when records align, when a verdict rests on evidence rather than urgency. That condition held. The file was complete. The community moved forward without ceremony. Each December still brought cold. Snow still fell on the river road. Lights appeared in windows and families gathered. Somewhere in the courthouse basement, a box labeled with a name and year remained, now marked resolved. It stayed there as proof that time, when matched with discipline, can still produce answers. In the years that followed the formal closure of the case, Rebecca Harper's name continued to exist in quieter systems, the ones rarely discussed outside law enforcement circles. Her file became a reference point during audits, cited when departments evaluated whether older evidence met evolving standards. Inspectors reviewed the seals on containers, the humidity logs in storage rooms, and the consistency of digital backups. Each check reinforced the same conclusion. The integrity of the record had been preserved, and that preservation had made resolution possible. Seasonal rhythms framed these reviews. They often happened in late fall when budgets reset and winter planning began. Snow forecasts returned to briefings, just as they had in 1995. Veterans of the department noted the symmetry. The same weather that complicated the original search now accompanied the case's lessons being passed forward. Nothing about it felt poetic. It felt practical, grounded in repetition. Rebecca's case also influenced how missing person reports were handled locally. Policies were updated to shorten thresholds for resource deployment during winter months, recognizing how exposure compressed timelines. Patrol supervisors referenced 1995 when arguing for early ground searches in rural corridors, especially near waterways. These changes did not carry Rebecca's name publicly, but internally they were understood as part of her legacy. The town itself remained understated. No annual ceremonies developed. The bench by the river weathered naturally, its plaque dulling under frost and sun. Maintenance crews cleared snow around it when plowing, not because of instruction, but because someone always did. Older residents sometimes paused there during winter walks, hands in pockets, remembering a different December long ago. In the courthouse, the case appeared occasionally in appellate training materials. Law clerks studied the written opinions affirming the conviction, noting how the court addressed delayed prosecution and evidentiary age. The language emphasized fairness, due process, and the necessity of corroboration beyond scientific matches. These principles resonated with judges who had spent careers guarding against shortcuts. Rebecca's parents moved quietly through their later years. They remained in Idaho, close to extended family. Their public involvement ended with the sentencing. Those who knew them understood that the resolution closed one chapter without reopening another. The law had spoken. The rest belonged to private memory. For investigators, the emotional weight arrived later, often unexpectedly. Retired detectives reported dreaming about old files, including Rebecca, not as crimes but as stacks of paper, boxes being moved from shelf to shelf. Psychologists who worked with departments explained that such dreams reflected the mind's attempt to finish unfinished work. In this case, the work was finished. The dreams faded. Technology continued to advance. New forensic methods emerged, more sensitive, more precise. Each time the question arose whether older solved cases needed reevaluation. Rebecca did not. The conviction rested on multiple independent pillars. There was nothing to reopen. That certainty mattered in an era when reversals sometimes followed innovation. Local journalism marked the 10th anniversary of the arrest with a brief column. It mentioned the weather that day, unseasonably cold, and noted how little disruption the arrest had caused. There were no sirens, no crowds. The column ended with a line about how some truths arrive quietly. Readers nodded and moved on. As decades passed, fewer residents remembered Rebecca personally. Her story became part of institutional history rather than shared experience. Yet the system she influenced continued to operate differently because of her case. That was how permanence worked in such contexts. Change embedded itself in procedure, not remembrance. The sheriff who had overseen the department in 1995 died years later. His obituary mentioned his commitment to unresolved cases. Among those who attended the service, several recalled how often he had asked about Rebecca Harper, even when nothing was new. That persistence, they agreed, had set a tone. Winter returned again and again. Snow fell on the same roads. Plows traced familiar paths. Courthouse windows glowed against early darkness. Inside, files moved, cases opened and closed. Somewhere in the archive, Rebecca Harper's case remained exactly where it belonged, complete, orderly, and quiet, a testament to patience rather than spectacle. The resolution did not rewrite history, it clarified it. It replaced uncertainty with record. For a community accustomed to long winters and steady routines, that was enough. The case had asked for time. Time had answered. In the years that followed the formal closure of the case, Rebecca Harper's name continued to exist in quieter systems, the ones rarely discussed outside law enforcement circles. Her file became a reference point during audits, cited when departments evaluated whether older evidence met evolving standards. Inspectors reviewed the seals on containers, the humidity logs in storage rooms, and the consistency of digital backups. Each check reinforced the same conclusion. The integrity of the record had been preserved, and that preservation had made resolution possible. Seasonal rhythms framed these reviews. They often happened in late fall when budgets reset and winter planning began. Snow forecasts returned to briefings, just as they had in 1995. Veterans of the department noted the symmetry. The same weather that complicated the original search now accompanied the case's lessons being passed forward. Nothing about it felt poetic. It felt practical, grounded in repetition. Rebecca's case also influenced how missing person reports were handled locally. Policies were updated to shorten thresholds for resource deployment during winter months, recognizing how exposure compressed timelines. Patrol supervisors referenced 1995 when arguing for early ground searches in rural corridors, especially near waterways. These changes did not carry Rebecca's name publicly, but internally they were understood as part of her legacy. The town itself remained understated. No annual ceremonies developed. The bench by the river weathered naturally, its plaque dulling under frost and sun. Maintenance crews cleared snow around it when plowing, not because of instruction, but because someone always did. Older residents sometimes paused there during winter walks, hands in pockets, remembering a different December long ago. In the courthouse, the case appeared occasionally in appellate training materials. Law clerks studied the written opinions affirming the conviction, noting how the court addressed delayed prosecution and evidentiary age. The language emphasized fairness, due process, and the necessity of corroboration beyond scientific matches. These principles resonated with judges who had spent careers guarding against shortcuts. Rebecca's parents moved quietly through their later years. They remained in Idaho, close to extended family. Their public involvement ended with the sentencing. Those who knew them understood that the resolution closed one chapter without reopening another. The law had spoken. The rest belonged to private memory. For investigators, the emotional weight arrived later, often unexpectedly. Retired detectives reported dreaming about old files, including Rebecca, not as crimes but as stacks of paper, boxes being moved from shelf to shelf. Psychologists who worked with departments explained that such dreams reflected the mind's attempt to finish unfinished work. In this case, the work was finished. The dreams faded. Technology continued to advance. New forensic methods emerged, more sensitive, more precise. Each time the question arose whether older solved cases needed reevaluation. Rebecca did not. The conviction rested on multiple independent pillars. There was nothing to reopen. That certainty mattered in an era when reversals sometimes followed innovation. Local journalism marked the 10th anniversary of the arrest with a brief column. It mentioned the weather that day, unseasonably cold, and noted how little disruption the arrest had caused. There were no sirens, no crowds. The column ended with a line about how some truths arrive quietly. Readers nodded and moved on. As decades passed, fewer residents remembered Rebecca personally. Her story became part of institutional history rather than shared experience. Yet the system she influenced continued to operate differently because of her case. That was how permanence worked in such contexts. Change embedded itself in procedure, not remembrance. The sheriff who had overseen the department in 1995 died years later. His obituary mentioned his commitment to unresolved cases. Among those who attended the service, several recalled how often he had asked about Rebecca Harper, even when nothing was new. That persistence, they agreed, had set a tone. Winter returned again and again. Snow fell on the same roads. Plows traced familiar paths. Courthouse windows glowed against early darkness. Inside, files moved, cases opened and closed. Somewhere in the archive, Rebecca Harper's case remained exactly where it belonged, complete, orderly, and quiet, a testament to patience rather than spectacle. The resolution did not rewrite history, it clarified it. It replaced uncertainty with record. For a community accustomed to long winters and steady routines, that was enough. The case had asked for time. Time had answered. Winter closed in once more, and with it came the quiet administrative steps that mark an investigation's true end. The clerk of court certified the final mandate, confirming that all appeals had been exhausted and the sentence affirmed. Copies were mailed, logged, and filed. The sheriff's department received notice and updated its internal registry. A single line changed status from active to closed, a procedural act carrying the weight of decades. Rebecca Harper's case was scheduled for final archival review, a formality required when a file exceeds a certain age. An evidence technician verified seals, photographed containers, and documented storage conditions one last time. Items authorized for destruction were handled according to statute, witnessed and recorded. Items designated for retention were reboxed and labeled for long-term preservation. The process was deliberate, unemotional, and exact. The final report summarized the investigation from first response to conviction. It noted environmental factors, investigative decisions, and scientific developments that had influenced the outcome. It included a chronology of custody for every evidentiary item, signatures spanning generations of officers. The language avoided narrative flourish. It was written to be read by people who value precision over drama. In December, the department hosted a modest retirement gathering for a detective who had worked the case in its final years. There were no speeches about heroism. Colleagues spoke briefly about diligence and restraint. Someone mentioned Rebecca Harper's name in passing, not as a reminder of tragedy, but as an example of why the work mattered. The room fell quiet, then returned to conversation. Outside, the town prepared for the holidays as it always had. Lights went up along the main street. The grocery store played seasonal music. Men who had lived there since the 90s noticed how routines endured. They remembered a different December when uncertainty had settled like snow and refused to melt. This December felt colder, perhaps, but clearer. The bench by the river remained brushed free of snow by passing hands. Its plaque bore no explanation, only facts. Visitors sat briefly, then moved on. The river flowed beneath ice, indifferent to memory. The road curved as it always had. Traffic slowed at dusk, headlights tracing familiar arcs. In institutional memory, Rebecca Harper's case became a reference cited without emotion. It appeared in training binders, policy discussions, and grant applications. It justified investments in storage and testing. It supported arguments for patience. It stood as evidence that methodical work can survive time. The man convicted lived out his sentence within the routine of the system. Intake, classification, and placement followed standard protocols. Annual reviews recorded behavior and health. There were no incidents that altered the record. The law had completed its function, and the system continued. Rebecca's family remained private. They received notice of each legal development as required. They acknowledged receipt. There were no further statements. Those who knew them understood that closure did not mean forgetting, only that the question had been answered. As years passed, fewer people spoke of the case aloud. New residents arrived unaware of the history. Old residents aged. Yet the structures that resolved the case remained in place, improved by what had been learned. Evidence rooms ran quieter. Databases synchronized more reliably. Winter searches began earlier. In another December, a young officer asked an older supervisor why certain protocols existed. The supervisor explained without telling a story, pointing instead to a policy number and a year. The officer nodded. That was how knowledge transferred now, embedded in rules rather than recollection. The courthouse files sat in order. The river froze and thawed. Snow fell and melted. Time continued. Rebecca Harper's case rested complete, its resolution neither loud nor fragile. It endured because it had been built carefully. For a community accustomed to long winters, that endurance mattered. It meant that loss had not been ignored, that uncertainty had not been accepted as permanent. It meant that when patience and procedure were applied without haste, answers could still emerge. The passage of time did not soften the standards by which the work was judged. Auditors from the state reviewed the file during a routine compliance check and found no deviations. They noted the clarity of documentation and the consistency of decision-making across years. Such observations rarely left internal reports, but they mattered to professionals who measured success by durability. Community memory shifted subtly. What had once been a current event became a reference point, then a footnote. Schools updated local history materials, focusing on infrastructure and agriculture, not crime. Yet the systems influenced by the case continued to function quietly in the background, shaping responses to emergencies when winter nights shortened margins for error. In the press archive, the original articles remained accessible, their tone restrained. Later pieces emphasized process over personality. Editors resisted the urge to revisit the details. They understood that restraint preserved trust. Readers, older now, appreciated the absence of spectacle. During a particularly severe winter, when storms closed highways and stranded motorists, search protocols implemented years earlier were credited with rapid responses. No one mentioned Rebecca Harper by name, but the procedures bore her imprint. Radios crackled, logs filled, and outcomes improved. The department's annual report included a single line noting the resolution of a legacy case. It sat among statistics about response times and training hours. That placement reflected a philosophy. Solved cases belong within the fabric of ongoing work, not above it. On a cold evening near the anniversary of the arrest, the courthouse lights stayed on late. Clerks finished end-of-year filings. Snow piled along the steps. Inside, the files were secure, the system stable. Outside, the town moved through darkness toward morning. Men who had followed the case from afar recognized the pattern. Resolution rarely arrived with closure rituals. It arrived with alignment when evidence, law, and time converged. That convergence had occurred here without compromise. The quiet aftermath continued. No memorials were added, no ceremonies scheduled. The bench remained sufficient. The river continued its course. The town accepted the outcome as part of its history, neither defining nor denying it. In the end, the measure of the investigation lay not in headlines but in records that could be trusted. Those records stood. The case remained solved, not as a story retold but as a fact maintained. Another winter came, and with it the certainty that some questions, answered carefully, can finally be set down. The final seasons passed without incident. Administrative calendars turned, training cycles repeated, equipment was replaced. The bench weathered another year. Snow fell again, briefly obscuring the plaque before melting away. A decade after the verdict, a policy review cited the case once more, this time as a benchmark for interagency cooperation. The notation was brief. It needed no elaboration. At a local library, archived newspapers were digitized. Volunteers scanned pages from the 90s, preserving headlines and margins. Rebecca Harper's name appeared in those scans, contextual and factual. The volunteers moved on, careful with the pages. Life continued. Roads were resurfaced. A new courthouse annex opened. The river flooded one spring and receded. Through it all, the resolved case remained unchanged, its conclusion stable against time. When winter returned yet again, it did so as it always had. Cold, quiet, familiar. The town endured, and so did the record, complete and sufficient. In professional circles, the case was sometimes mentioned during conferences, not as a highlight but as an example of longevity. Presenters spoke about evidence stewardship and the value of revisiting assumptions. Attendees took notes, recognizing applicability beyond any single file. The legal community referenced the appellate opinions in continuing education materials. They illustrated how courts weigh delayed prosecutions when supported by corroborated science and careful investigation. The opinions were cited accurately and sparingly. Back home, winter festivals came and went. Children skated on temporary rinks. Older residents watched from benches, recalling how time layers memory. The river froze, then cracked. The town listened to the sound and kept moving. At last the year turned. Another January arrived. The ledger remained closed, the answer held. The work had been finished without haste and without error. That fact endured, steady as the seasons, requiring nothing further. It stood as confirmation that patience, documentation, and lawful method can answer even the longest questions, and that such answers, once secured, deserve quiet respect rather than repetition. The winter nights settled, and the town slept, confident that diligence had prevailed and that the record would remain intact. Nothing more needed saying. The case was finished, the lesson absorbed, and the season passed. Snow fell lightly, then stopped, leaving the town unchanged and certain. Time moved forward, carrying clarity with it. The answer held, and winter continued. The record remained, complete and sufficient. Quiet endured. Winter passed again. Case closed finally. End.